If you're taking the LSAT soon, you don't need 18 different prep books, a 7-day-a-week burnout schedule, or some magic strategy you found when plumbing the depths of Google at 2 a.m. You don't need more, you need better. Specifically, you need to know what's actually going to be on the test and how to study in a way that gives you the highest return per minute. And that's exactly what I'm going to share with you today. No fluff, no guesswork, just strategy based on real data and what LSAC has actually been doing. Now let's kill a common myth. People think LSAC writes a fresh, brand new LSAT for every single test date, like some secret team of logic geniuses cranking out new questions every single month. But that's actually not how it works. Here's what's really happening. LSAC is reusing old LSATs, ones that were given in the past but never released to the public. These are called non-disclosed tests. You take them, you get your score, and that's it. You never see those questions again. You don't even get to know which ones you got right or wrong. And then they recycle those same unreleased LSATs months or even years later. Let me say that again so it sinks in. You could be taking a test that someone else took a couple years ago and never knew it was coming back. Now here's the part that messes with people. Because LSAC gives the test over multiple days, and because there are always multiple test forms, you and someone else could take the LSAT at the exact same time and get completely different exams. So you get a reading comp section with a dense passage on Viking warrior women, and they get one on Chilean agriculture. And both of you are taking the test at 9 a.m. on Saturday, but you weren't taking the exact same LSAT. This happens all the time, and LSAC does it on purpose to make it harder to predict what's real versus what's experimental and to prevent answer sharing or test day intel leaks. They also mix up the order of the sections. So even if you and a friend both had reading comp first and logical reasoning second, that doesn't mean you had the same questions. You might have had totally different content, just the sections in the same order. That's why after the test, people go online and they try to figure out which section was scored and which was experimental, but it's almost impossible unless you wrote down detailed notes right after the test. So here's what we have our students do. As soon as the test is over, we have them jot down the order of the sections, what topics were covered, which ones felt unusually hard or weird, and any memorable question themes like, for example, coral fluorescence. Why? Because this helps you figure out what version you got and whether your tough section was scored or experimental, and whether it might make sense for you to start prepping for a retake now. More importantly, this information helps you stop spiraling. You might walk out thinking, I bombed it. That reading comp section was impossible. But if you compare notes with other students and you realize, oh, that was the unscored section, it completely changes how you feel about your performance. And no, you're not going to get any of this info from LSAC. They won't tell you which section was experimental. They won't even show you your test. And they definitely won't admit which old test they recycled. But we see the same test forms appear again and again, sometimes years apart, with the same question topics, same structures, same quirks. And if you know what kind of questions you might be getting ahead of time, you can train for the test with scary precision. And one more thing, because of how many versions LSAC needs for each test date, remember, they run it over several days with both in-person and online options, they're burning through their stockpiles of old exams. So they're reusing the same test forms multiple times across different months, sometimes even different years. That's why, even though you'll never see the test after you take it, there's still a pattern. And if you know how to spot it and how to prep for it, you'll be light years ahead of most students who are still guessing in the dark. Now, logical reasoning makes up 2/3 of your LSAT score. That means if you get good at this section, you're way ahead. But here's what most people get wrong. They try to master every single question type equally, like each one matters the same. Let me save you some time. LSAC writes all different kinds of logical reasoning questions, but they don't show up with equal frequency. Not even close. If you're short on time, here are the 3 question types that show up most often and will have the biggest impact on your score. They are flaw, inference, and necessary assumption. Flaw questions ask you to spot what's wrong with the argument. Inference questions ask you what has to be true based on the facts. And necessary assumption questions ask you to spot the piece of reasoning that the argument depends upon. These aren't the only question types that matter, but they're the ones that appear the most, especially across multiple sections of logical reasoning. So when we work with students, this is usually where we start. Instead of splitting your time equally across every exotic question type, you go deep on the ones that show up the most and build your accuracy and timing from there. Now, flaw questions have gotten a bit more subtle over time. Older prep books might drill you on the classic flaw categories like circular reasoning or ad hominem attacks, but the more recent LSATs are testing deeper logic, like why a conclusion isn't fully supported, even if it sounds reasonable. So you gotta think critically here, not just match definitions. Now, necessary assumption questions are often the key to unlocking tougher arguments. LSAC loves to hide the assumption behind vague or abstract wording. Your job is to find out what the argument quietly relies on and prove that without it, the whole thing falls apart. Now you might be thinking, but Steve, what about all the other question types like parallel, evaluate the argument, resolve the paradox, weaken, and so on? Those matter too, of course, especially if you're aiming for 170 and above, but they do show up less often than the others, and they usually have a lower point to effort ratio. That means you should prioritize the heavy hitters first, then work your way down. Now, don't be surprised if you get 2 or 3 parallel questions per section, or 2 resolve the paradox questions, and 1 nasty gotcha question somewhere in the first 10. And you're not going to know which of these exactly is going to come up first, but if you train for the most common patterns and build real skills, instead of memorizing cheap tricks, you're going to be ready no matter what version of the test you get. Now, once you've locked in the major question types like flaw, inference, and necessary assumption, it's time to deal with the rest of the section. The stuff that shows up consistently, throws students off, and eats up time if you're not ready. So let's talk about a couple of the less popular question types that students consistently hate. One of the least favorite types consistently is parallel reasoning and its cousin, parallel flaw. These questions are long, like unnecessarily long. They often show up in the second half of the section, like questions 15 through 25 or so, and they are deliberately designed to slow you down. You'll be reading a full argument, then comparing it to 5 other equally long arguments to see which one matches the same reasoning or error. The trap is that most students will try to match based on the topic or other surface level features, and that never works. Instead, what you want to do is strip the original argument down to its skeleton. What's the logic structure? Is it causal, conditional, a comparison? Then you scan the choices looking for one that does the exact same thing, even if the words are totally different. Now, if you're short on time, you can, of course, flag it, skip it, and come back later. What you don't want to do is get stuck in the quicksand and let one question derail the whole section. Now, another type students consistently dislike is resolve the paradox. And these are little logic puzzles disguised as arguments. They give you 2 facts that seem to contradict each other, and your job is to explain how both can be true at the same time. Now, a lot of students will panic here because the stimulus feels incomplete. But that's the point. What you want to do is look for assumptions that would make both facts true, like different groups being compared, different time frames, or hidden exceptions. These can be fast points if you practice them under timed conditions. But if you overthink them, you're going to burn way too much time trying to solve a riddle that doesn't actually require deep thinking, just simple logic. Now, almost every test will throw in one surprisingly hard question early, somewhere in the first 10. Why? Because LSAC knows that's when students are still getting their footing. Now, that's pretty sneaky. You might think, this is question 4. It should be easy. Then you waste 4 minutes stuck on it, second-guessing yourself, and boom, your pacing is wrecked. So don't assume the early questions are all going to be freebies. If something feels weird or overly difficult, skip it and come back later. You're not giving up here, you're making a smart trade to protect your time. We've worked with plenty of students who went from being stuck at 160 to scoring 170 and beyond just by learning to cut their losses early and bank more time for the higher value questions. Now, some questions show up just often enough to be worth prepping, but not enough to build your whole study plan around. These would be sufficient assumption, point out issue, and evaluate the argument. For sufficient assumption, these are not that common, but when they show up, they can be pretty tricky. You're being asked here to prove the conclusion and guarantee it, which requires a very specific logical connection. Pointed issue questions, you're being asked what two people disagree about. And if you understand how to map out conflicting viewpoints, it's an easy point. Then evaluate the argument questions are quite rare, but they still will come up every now and then, and these ask what additional information would help you better assess the argument's strength. Now, you don't need to master these perfectly unless you're aiming for the higher 160s and beyond, but if you are familiar with the format, it gives you a huge advantage if and when they show up on test day. Bottom line, logical reasoning is full of patterns, and LSAC repeats them more often than you might think. The more familiar you are with the structure of these questions, the less time you're going to waste second-guessing yourself. Don't try to be perfect. Instead, aim to be strategic. If a question looks like it'll be a time sink, flag it, skip it, and move on. If something looks weird early in the section, assume it's a trap. If a question feels new or weird, it's probably just wearing a different disguise. Learn to recognize the logic behind the noise, and suddenly the section becomes way more manageable. Now let's talk about reading comp, which is the most misunderstood section on the LSAT. Most people think it's about reading speed. They'll say, I just need to read faster, or I'm going to read The Economist every single morning. That's like saying you're going to train for a boxing match by running on the treadmill. Reading comp is not about speed. It's about knowing exactly what to look for and ignoring everything else. Now in reading comp, there are 4 passages, 3 long ones and then a pair of short dual ones on a related topic. And almost every single time, they follow the same basic rotation. You have natural science, social science, humanities, and law. The exact topics change, but the themes and structures will repeat constantly. We've seen the same obscure topics pop up again and again. That could include migration patterns, linguistic theories, even random things like the political history of Brooklyn, Illinois. They are not choosing these topics at random. They are deliberately pulling from a rotation of pre-written, unreleased passages. So if you've done enough real practice, many passages will feel oddly familiar, and that is a huge advantage. Now, LSAC is not testing whether you read fast. They don't care. They're testing how well you can spot the main point, track the structure of the argument, identify the author's tone and any biases, and predict where the passage is going. If you can do that, you don't need to memorize details. You're going to know where to look when the questions ask you. And that skill separates those in the mid-150s from 170 and beyond. And when we work with students, we train them to treat reading comp like an argument-based section, not a trivia game. You don't need to memorize every single little fact, but you do need to know why the author included those facts in the first place. Now, there are some trends in reading comp as it's evolving over time. LSAC is shifting toward more abstract writing styles. The passages lately feel more academic and less news-oriented, so you can expect phrases like problematizing the conventional framework instead of them saying, here's a simple example. We're also seeing more increased complexity in structure. You're going to see more multi-paragraph turns. The author will sometimes switch tone mid-passage. They might introduce 2 viewpoints, then drop a third one at the end all of a sudden. And if you're not tracking the structure, you're going to get lost fast. We're also seeing harder dual passages with the passage A, passage B comparison, and a bunch of questions asking how they relate. LSAC is leaning a lot harder on this format in recent years, and the questions require more precise thinking. So to get ready for the reading comp sections, don't just do more reading comp, do it right. Do 1 full reading comp section every other day, and do not skip the most boring passage. Spend more time on it, if anything. Review every single question, even the ones where you guessed and got it right. Ask, what was the trap? Why did the right answer work? Why did I find the wrong answer tempting? And track your patterns. Are you missing the author's tone? Are you missing specific line reference questions? Are you missing the comparison questions? Whatever the mistakes are, that is your new to-do list going forward. And practice predicting the structure of the passage as you read. This is the closest thing there is on the LSAT to a cheat code. And by the way, as a bonus, if you see the same topics showing up on multiple LSATs, there's a good chance it's going to come back again. These passages are often written by the same few test writers, and they have their own signature styles. And once you learn how to read those styles, they get way easier. Now, most students make the mistake of trying to brute force reading comp. They read faster, or they'll reread the whole passage every time a question confuses them. But a better idea would be to read the passage once with a purpose. Know the structure. Know the role each paragraph plays. And if you get stuck, don't reread the whole thing. Go back to the exact line and reread it just enough to anchor yourself. Reading comp isn't a race, it's actually a logic game in disguise. Now let's talk about the section that messes more with LSAT takers than any other, the experimental section. Here's what you need to know. Every LSAT has 4 sections: 2 scored logical reasoning sections, 1 scored reading comp section, and 1 unscored extra section of either logical reasoning or reading comp, and it is randomly inserted anywhere in your test. The worst part is, you're not going to know which one it is while you're taking the exam. So if you bomb a section, you might think your score's toast, when in fact, you just tanked the experimental. Or maybe you crushed a section and it felt amazing, only you find out later that section is not the one that counted. It's cruel, but that's how the LSAT works. Now here's what you shouldn't do. Don't try to figure out which section is the experimental during the test. That is just a mental trap. You're gonna waste brain power second guessing yourself. You'll be thinking, wait, was that second logical reasoning too weird to be the real one? Or why were there 2 reading comps? Which one counted? That kind of thinking will only distract you, slow you down, and hurt your score. So treat every section like it's real. You can't afford not to. Now here's what you should do right after the test ends. Write everything down. Write down what order your sections appeared in. What were the passage and the question topics? Which section felt hardest? And did any section feel strangely familiar or unusually vague? It sounds simple, but it's powerful. That information can help you figure out, with a pretty high degree of accuracy, which content was scored and which content wasn't. And if you're thinking, I'll just remember it later, spoiler, you won't. We've seen it over and over. Students will swear they're going to remember every single detail, and then 24 hours later, it's like the test never even happened. You'll forget what came first. You'll forget what the 3rd reading comp passage was about, and you'll start doubting what you even saw. So please write it down immediately. If you can track this stuff, it's going to give you a lot of peace of mind while you're waiting for your score, because if you know that your toughest section was experimental, you're going to sleep better. It'll also let you make a more informed decision about whether to retake. Let's say you finish the test and think, I totally blew it. But then you compare notes with others, and it turns out your hardest section was, in fact, that unscored extra section. That could be the difference between retaking or not. It also gives you a better view of how LSAC designs the test. When students share their notes with us after the test, it helps us better map out what LSAC is rotating through, what's real, what's been reused, and how often certain topics show up. And here's one more advanced tip. Sometimes LSAC will use similar topics in multiple sections to confuse you even further, like 2 different reading comp sections both mentioning finance, one real, one experimental. Without clear notes, it's almost impossible to tell them apart later. Now let's say 2 students take the LSAT on the same day. One student gets a reading comp section with a passage about Viking warrior women. The other gets a passage on Brooklyn, Illinois. They both go online after the test and say, wow, reading comp was brutal. But they're not even talking about the same section. One of them had a real scored reading comp section. The other had an unscored extra reading comp that didn't count. And neither of them knows unless they kept good notes. That's why this matters, not just for curiosity, but because knowing what was real versus what wasn't affects how you review, whether you retake, and how confident you are walking into the next one if in fact there is a next one. So now that you know how the LSAT actually works, the recycled tests, the high frequency question types, the recycled reading comp topics, the experimental chaos, let's make this useful. Because none of this even matters if it doesn't change how you study. First, focus on what's actually being tested. If you're scoring under 160, spend the majority of your logical reasoning time focused on the 3 high-impact question types: necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. And don't just do questions, review them deeply until you understand exactly why every wrong answer is wrong. Aim to get each one right in under 90 seconds if possible, and skip the rare question types for now. You don't need to master every format to hit a 160 or above. But if you're already scoring 160 or higher and you're aiming for a 170 plus, your priorities have to shift. Of course, you still need to be sharp on the high frequency stuff, but now you also need to train for speed, nuance, and abstraction. So now you have to practice the weird, rare ones also, like parallels, dual comparative reading comp passages, as well as sufficient assumption, strengthened principle, and so on. And you've also got to review every correct one you guessed on and got lucky, like it was a wrong answer, because it could have just as easily gone the other way. If you got it right for the wrong reason, it's still a liability. And so for this reason, we tailor our students' personal study plans based on score range, weak points, and how soon their test is. But the general principle is still the same. Stop trying to be equally good at everything. Focus on the questions that move your score the most. You also want to stop treating reading comprehension like it's a reading test. Reading comp rewards prediction, not recall. So here's how to train. Do one full reading comp section every other day, at minimum. Practice predicting the main point and structure as you read. And don't just answer the questions. Go back and ask, why did I get this wrong? Why did I get this right? What would have made this question harder? And make a list of the topics or passage styles that trip you up. That is your hit list. And if a passage topic keeps showing up in different LSATs, there is a reason. This is not random. They're part of LSAC's rotation, and they often come back in the future. Now, you also want to practice those time wasters under pressure, like parallel reasoning and resolve the paradox. And these aren't always hard, but they're long. And if you go into them without a strategy, they're going to eat up minutes you cannot afford to lose. So the solution is drill them under a timer, not casually. The goal here is not to rush. It's to recognize the moment a question's starting to drag, and then you can decide whether to commit or skip. And the best LSAT scorers don't try to win every question on the first try. They skip, they flag it, and they come back later with better time management than the competition. Now, here's something nobody tells you. If you're doing LSAT prep right, you will constantly feel like you're just barely getting it. And that's normal. If you're always comfortable, you're either repeating old material or you're avoiding your weak spots. Either way, it's not helping. So lean into the questions that confuse you, that make you second guess, that hurt your brain a little. That is the exact discomfort that leads to breakthroughs. Now, let me tell you what happens after most people take the LSAT. They walk out of the testing room or they log off, they stare into space and they think to themselves, I blew it. They feel like they got every reading comp passage wrong. They feel like logical reasoning melted their brain, and they start Googling, how bad is -10 on the LSAT? Now, here's the truth. That feeling means absolutely nothing. The LSAT is designed to feel hard. It's not supposed to feel like you crushed it. It's supposed to stretch your brain in ways that make you uncomfortable, even if you're scoring in the 170s. So if you walk out thinking, I'm not sure how that went, that's normal. If you walk out feeling like it was harder than any practice test, also normal. And if you walk out and think, did I hallucinate a passage about Viking warrior women? No, that was real, but you're still fine. Now, it's not about how confident you feel. It's about whether you were trained on what LSAC actually tests and whether you handled the pressure without falling apart. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to answer every single question, and you don't have to feel amazing when it's over. You just got to do what most test takers won't. Focus on the questions that matter most, manage your time, stay calm when things get weird, and keep going even when you're not sure. Now, one of the biggest mindset shifts we teach our students is this. Confidence doesn't come before performance, it comes after. You train, you study smarter, you get the reps in. And on test day, you don't need to feel like a genius. You just gotta show up and execute the plan you practiced. That's what gets results. Now go do it.